So good afternoon everybody, it's lovely to see you here for the third of this semester's music talks, and it's a great privilege today to be able to welcome a great friend and colleague, Michael Koenig, originally from Austria. Michael has had a very distinctive career as an organist and also as a radio producer, but he's made a very distinctive niche for himself through his extraordinary work nurturing the organ culture in Africa, and now also as a researcher at the University of Oxford, exploring the global dimensions of what might traditionally have been associated as a relic of white colonialism in the former colonies of the United Kingdom. Michael has extraordinary insights through his many trips to Africa. He's going to share those with us this afternoon and also just explore some of the implications of his research. So will you please give a very warm welcome to Michael Koenig.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. On the 5th of July this year, Andrew Netzinger, the current Director of Music at St. John's College, Cambridge, was named as the new organist and master of the choristers at Westminster Abbey, scheduled to start his tenure there by the beginning of 2023. This historic appointment of the first person of colour in what is arguably the top position in the Anglican church music world was only possible because of the global aspects of British pipe organ culture. That is to say, Mr. Netzinger's father, Lucien Netzinger, was born in 1936 in Colombo, Sri Lanka, which was then British Ceylon. He was exposed to classical music from an early age on, then trained at the Royal College of Music in London under Herbert Howells before reading music at King's College, Cambridge. Lucien Netzinger then became the Director of Music at St. Michael's Seminary in 1959 and moved on to Exeter Cathedral as the Director of Music there in 1973. I would say a remarkable global career. And from these initial remarks, you may already understand why, when Chris invited me to talk about these global aspects here at St. Andrews, I was truly excited, as I thoroughly believe in the importance of this topic. In today's talk, after giving you reasons why we should care about these global aspects, I would like to elaborate a bit more about two concrete areas that I've recently been working on. One thing, however, has to be stated right up front. It is remarkable how much there is still left to be done. Literally, there is a whole organ world, quote unquote, waiting to be discovered. But first, why should we care about the global aspects of British pipe organ culture, particularly in an applied and not purely academic context? So I'm also speaking, of course, to the organ colleagues amongst you. There are quite a number of reasons, of course, but to start, let me show you a musical example from Ghana. This is a piece written by James Armour and accompanied at the organ by the composer. this video shows quite well that we are not alone in what we do here in Britain, on the European continent, or in North America. From my own experience in a number of African countries other than Ghana, I can testify how vibrant and enthusiastic the organ and choral music scene is there. But more on that note later. For now, all I would like to do is plead for us in the organ community particularly to be open about the fascinating forms of artistic expression that are going on outside our usual radius of interests and activities. Particularly at a day and age when we are often seen as, dare I say, parochial and isolated within the musical world, as well as elitist and predominantly white and male. If we were to consider various global aspects of organ music, we would have to admit that this is actually a case of self-inflicted harm mostly that we would easily be able to rebut. For instance, in Australia in the 1870s and 1890s, probably 1/3 of all organists, including those performing as acclaimed recitalists, were women. As a matter of fact, even to this day, many of the preeminent female organists in Britain have connections from what is known amongst historians as the British world. Just think of Dame Gillian Weir from New Zealand, Anne Page, who teaches at Cambridge University and the Royal Academy of Music, and who is well known here too. She's from Australia. Sarah MacDonald, the Director of Music at Selwyn College, Cambridge, and Rachel Mowden, the Director of Music at Coventry Cathedral, both from Canada, or Catherine Deanish-Williams, the Director of Music of Guildford Cathedral, also from New Zealand. Also, for about 100 years, from around 1850 to 1950, organs were a fixture in those secular music practices that were particularly intended for non-elite strata of society. Town hall organs all across the British Isles, but also all across Australia, New Zealand and South Africa were used to bring orchestral music to the masses in an affordable way. Consider it is much cheaper to build an organ and then only pay one player rather than having to hire an entire orchestra every time. Notably at a time when orchestras in this country, and that would be another research topic, were still rare as opposed to the European continent. A relic of this civic and secular practice, by the way, is the use of organ music in university graduations, which is still ongoing. Also consider, for instance, when an assembly of 3,000 was meant to sing the national anthem, at the time before the invention of PA systems, the organ was the only instrument that could lead this singing, in the absence, of a brass band. Later, theatre organs all across the world would accompany silent films, and the core of this instrument type was the work of an Englishman who had emigrated to the United States around 1900, Robert Hope Jones. Only the advent of the talkies made cinema organs redundant. And still, for instance, in 1937, a big cinema organ was built by Compton at the Odeon, Leicester Square, and it still exists and it's being played regularly. Of course, you've already seen ample racial inclusivity in the examples of Mr. Netzinger and the performance from Ghana, but allow me now to focus more specifically on two areas of my own current research. The latter of these two will bring us back to Africa in a few moments, but first let us go to Australia, as I'm currently studying the advent of large town hall organs there. Most recently, the instrument at Sydney Town Hall that was inaugurated in 1890 and was then the largest organ in the world, larger than any organ in what was called then the mother country, Britain, where the instrument from 1870 at the Royal Albert Hall by Henry Willis was the largest organ. As academics, we always have to position our research in the context of what is otherwise going on. So my research, which is part of my doctoral work in Oxford, wishes to help in the development of a better general understanding of the dissemination of British pipe organs across British settler societies during the second half of what's called the long 19th century, as well as to interrogate to what extent the presence of these instruments, their music and their players, was determined by and helped to contribute to a shared cultural identity amongst these neo-British people. Therefore, whilst being allocated disciplinarily at the crossroads of global musicology and global and imperial history, my research builds on research from areas as widespread as political, cultural and social history, organology, material culture, network theory, architectural history and the history of technology. However, the two main areas of scholarship to which my dissertation wishes to contribute are, on one hand, research that is part of the emerging field of global musicology and within that field examines the presence of European musical practices, genres and ensembles around the world, such as opera, art song or brass bands, and on the other hand, research commonly known as the British World Project, which exists since the late 1990s, which examines the shared histories of Britain and her former settler colonies and dominions by using a synoptic model of analysis. What I'm arguing here is that global musicology, due to an almost complete lack of research related to the musical commonalities between Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, may benefit from a wider adoption of that British world model, and that the study of music, on the other hand, which is so far almost non-existent in British world historiography, may help to define that British world and its sometimes blurry contours more clearly. So there might be benefits on both sides. In 2018, Richard Drayton and David Mortadell, two prominent global historians, proclaimed that there is no way back out of the global turn in our century. Yet, when this statement was made, musicologists had only just begun to find their respective ways into this global turn, whilst historians had already worked with this global turn since the 1990s, which was concurrent with the emergence of a new unipolar world order after the end of the Cold War. In recent years, global musicology has emerged as an umbrella term covering scholarship from a wide range of methodological and epistemological approaches. However, British settled territories, as I've already alluded to, have so far been largely overlooked in all these areas of global musicology. The conceptual frameworks behind existing studies are either based on a post-colonial dialectic, on geographical parameters such as the Atlantic Ocean, or on musical genres and ensembles like opera and brass bands. A framework that allows for a synoptic examination of the shared musical histories of British or more widely Anglophone societies around the world is almost completely missing. The model of the British world, however, would provide such framework. This historical model grew out of the explanatory impasse encountered by historians during the 1970s, 80s and 90s who were attempting to write the connected histories of Britain and Britain's former white dominions within the then dominant paradigms of individual, national or imperial historiographies, the latter operating on a quite crude center-periphery structure. Much of the existing British world scholarship grew out of conferences held in turn in Britain and the former Dominion countries between 1998 and 2007. One of the common themes is to restore the British elements in these histories, as is the study of the shared political, economic and cultural ties that was largely or had been largely neglected until then, particularly by historians that worked since the end of the Second World War. Across British world literature, there is a widespread agreement that a shared cultural identity must be conceptualized as a prime requirement for cohesion amongst neo-British societies. Music, however, despite being a powerful tool for identity building, as we all know as musicians, not least through its use in military ceremonies and state functions, has barely become a study object in British world scholarship. Thus, there's a wide open area for research ahead of us that could include projects such as the comparison of orchestral practices in Adelaide, South Australia, and Pietermaritzburg, Natal, or of lead reception in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Wellington, New Zealand, or of operatic performances in Sydney, New South Wales, and Toronto, Ontario, all in relation to what went on in the musical metropoles like London, Manchester, New York, and Boston. And all this would enrich both the fields of global musicology as well as the British world or Anglo-world history. Thereby, an observation by Philip Buckner and Douglas Francis from 2005 would have continuing value, and I quote, "The purpose of resurrecting the concept of a British world is not an exercise in imperial nostalgia, a lament for a world we have lost. Scholars who study Britishness and believe in its historical significance do not necessarily identify with it or approve of imperialism in any form. Our goal is to re-examine a complex phenomenon and to understand how it shaped the world in which we now live." But now, let us go right to Sydney. On the 9th of August 1890, after 6 years of planning and construction, the then largest pipe organ in the world was introduced to the public in a grand recital, played by W.T. Best from Liverpool. The location was the recently inaugurated Centennial Hall of Sydney in New South Wales, which was then the world's largest town hall. With both the building and its enormous organ, the capital of Britain's oldest Australian colony intended to celebrate, slightly belatedly, the centenary of the arrival of the first fleet in Botany Bay in 1788. Moreover, the Centennial Hall was meant to represent the progress Australia had made since it became, as it was understood then, a part of the quote-unquote civilized world. And the enormous organ had to play an integral part in underscoring this narrative of progress. Nevertheless, the Centennial Hall organ, despite its magnitude, had little to offer in terms of progress. Built in London by the distinguished firm of William Hill and Sons, it neither used cutting-edge technology nor did it follow innovative principles of tonal aesthetics. Therefore, not long after its inauguration, criticism began to emerge around the world for this lack of innovation, and there has been consensus ever since that the Centennial Hall organ was retrograde already by the time it opened. Strikingly, however, no scholarly attempts have been made so far to determine the reasons for this outdatedness. Thus, my research here has a twofold purpose. Firstly, in relation to the overall topic of my dissertation, which is entitled, now brace yourselves, British Pipe Organs and Organ Building as Symbols of Shared Identity, Economic Power and Technological Prowess Across the British World. This dissertation considers the Centennial organ as an immovable, highly valued object of material culture situated in a space of considerable symbolic and political significance, and thereby it seeks to confirm that the contextual study of representational pipe organs is a valuable method for generating new knowledge about the cultural history of the British world. Secondly, I seek to address the so far unanswered question about the reasons for the outdatedness of the Centennial Hall organ. And what I'm arguing is that the reliance on tried and tested instrument types and trading relations that were already in place, this was perceived as a safer way to show Sydney's and New South Wales's advancements as a society than the use of cutting-edge but untried organ technologies. Furthermore, direct personal gain of money and status amongst the people involved had a higher priority than an insistence in a kind of innovation that only a few people in that imperial periphery would fully have understood. In the light of a complete absence of any directly relatable scholarship, as I've already alluded to, I had to find the analytical tools for my research elsewhere, notably in the fields of history of technology and, of course, in the history of the British world. In concrete, I draw from the work of David Edgerton on technology and the work by Gary McGee and Andrew Thompson on the economic and cultural networks across the British world. David Edgerton's shock of the old is a plea for a new, use-centered approach to the history of technology, as opposed to an almost exclusive focus on the small number of places where innovation and invention is concentrated, which was predominant in previous historiography. Edgerton compellingly demonstrates that whenever newer technologies become available, older technologies frequently remain in use. Edgerton also argues that historians, in their fixation on progress, all too often neglect to explore the reasons for this continued use of old technology. Instead, according to Edgerton, the presence of old technology is dismissed as mere conservatism and resistance to new technology, as has also been the case in the restoration report of the Sydney Town Hall organ by Calvin Hastie from 2016. McGee and Thompson, on the other hand, in Empire and Globalization, provide the necessary analytical framework for my study, which feeds into a field that Carl Bridge and Ken Fedorovich, two other eminent historians of the British world, have called globalization from below. That is to say, migration, commerce, and finance have to be seen as the prime enablers of connectivity between Britain and British settler societies during the period in question, and they were further reinforced through cultural homogeneity and an easy flow of information and strong political congruence. The approach of McGee and Thompson also allows to formulate a definition of the British Empire that complements but does not contradict the more common post-colonial approaches by scholars like Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, or Homi Bhabha. According to McGee and Thompson, in the context of British settler societies, the British Empire was, I quote, an interconnected zone constituted by multiple points of contact and conflicts, circuits of exchange, end quote. And this is succinctly represented by the metaphor of a system of networks. Thus, terminology from network theory, such as social capital or network dynamics, can be applied to analyze the genesis of the Sydney Town Hall organ. To further summarize my findings, I'm providing insights into the decision-making processes that were at play in neo-British societies around 1890 and involved a multi-layered system of networks and distinct groups of people. There were the municipal authorities of Sydney who justified the expenditure for the new organ with fantastically sounding predictions of population growth. They spread the narrative that by 2000, Australia would be home to nearly 190 million people. Well, in fact, according to the United Nations report of 2001, it was home to less than 20 million people, so only about a tenth. Nevertheless, it was believed that the rapid population growth of the 1880s deserved to have the largest town hall building and the largest town hall instrument in the world. However, behind the scenes, Sydney's authorities used the new organ to position their city within the networks of other affluent cities around the globe. Melbourne, of course, the obvious example, but also other cities like Chicago, like Cape Town, you name it, really all-encompassing the globe. And then we had the official networks here at play of the town clerks, the city councils, and the London-based New South Wales Agent General, and they played an integral part in nominating the advisory committee, which then selected the builder of the organ. The potential builders themselves, they showed varying degrees of networking abilities with their potential Australian clients. Some builders had instruments and representatives already in Australia. Others did not really care to engage at all. And not surprisingly, only those builders with a physical presence were shortlisted for Sydney Town Hall. Finally, the firm of William Hill and Son, which ultimately got to build the organ, had their own close personal network involved in the project, and thus adjusted the circumstances in a way conducive to their desired outcome. There is little doubt that the two most relevant English firms at the time, which were Hill and Willis, really had a sort of competition going on. Nicholas Thistlethwaite, who is the established authority on Victorian pipe organs, has remarked that Willis through his skill as engineer, mechanic and artist, was able to capture the public imagination and steal a march on his rivals, the most notable, of course, being Hill. And Thistlethwaite further adds that William Hill had been responsible for innovations of the utmost importance in the evolution of the English organ, but tonally his instruments retained strong stylistic links with the builders of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Willis, though, created a new style in which scaling, voicing, wind pressures and regulation conspired to create a different tonal ethos. So you had really these two very different personalities here of organ builders, Hill and William Hill and his successor Thomas and then later Arthur Hill, who were obviously having a really conservative approach, and then you had Willis on the other hand. And of course Willis was the builder of the very, very innovative instrument at the Albert Hall, and it was because of the difference in the outlook of these two societies, London and Sydney, that Hill's rather conservative approach could merely exist in New South Wales, even though it created somewhat of a contradiction with the narrative of the building that was of colonial progress. Whilst Hill, of course, was the dominating progressive force in London. But now let's make a move over to Africa, and there things get even more complex. In all English-speaking Christian countries in Africa at present, we can observe a rich organ and church music culture and an appreciation of organ music that is at least as strong as it is here in Britain, in Europe and North America. In our parts of the world, our quote-unquote superb pipe organs, new and historic ones, are available almost everywhere. Also, there is hardly any shortage of competent organ teachers, and programs and initiatives intended to enthuse young people into playing the organ are increasingly more common, such as the well-known Organ Kits, which is, for those who haven't seen it before, this is basically a kit that comes in 1 or 2 boxes, and then you basically make it a group activity with a couple of children to assemble this, and then it will, you can play, and you have about roughly 2 octaves of keys, and I think it's 2 stops, isn't it, that you can use, so you can basically show the principles of a pipe organ in this little model. These programs and initiatives, however, they are also manifestations, I would argue, of a prevalent fear of decline here amongst us. It is well documented that the number of young people enrolling as organ students at conservatoires, or indeed applying to be organ scholars at Oxford or Cambridge, has been declining for years now. Organ and church music departments on the continent have been closing, and those students who still graduate here and there and in North America have to become increasingly more creative in finding work. The situation in sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, is entirely different. A great multitude of young people feels attracted by the organ there. They want to play because organists are rare, but also because of the strong religious adherence in African societies, not least amongst young people. And there is a high demand of church organists, especially in conjunction with hymn singing, which is overwhelmingly strong across the entire continent. However, infrastructure, the same infrastructure that we have in abundance, is almost completely absent in Africa. But coming back to history, the reason why we do have pipe organs in Africa in the first place is yet a different story. It is a complex one, and at times also a painful and messy one, as we will see in a moment in relation to Kenya. Before we go there, allow me to summarize the general trends of British colonization at the time. These trends were, by and large, threefold. There was, number 1, access to raw materials. Number 2, strategic positioning, such as keeping the shipping route to India clear by maintaining outposts from Gibraltar over to Malta and Cyprus, then controlling Egypt for the Suez Canal, and then again having an outpost in Aden near the eastern approach to the Red Sea. And thirdly, it was the creation of new spaces for people of British stock, as it was called then, to live in, as in a Malthusian sense, the carrying capacity of the British Isles was seen as being all but finite. The organists amongst you will know that the period in question here, roughly speaking again the 100 years between 1850 and 1950, was also the period that saw the most significant innovations in organ building, and especially console design, since the establishment of a fairly standardized way of organ building during the 14th to 16th centuries. The second half of the 19th century came with a whole laundry list, really, of innovations related to pipe organ technology. There were new systems of transmission between the keys and the pipes. There were pistons for quick registration changes. There was, of course, also the balanced swell pedal, just to name a few. During this time, in general, science and technology attained a quasi-religious status in Victorian Britain. And exploring and mapping unknown continents was part of that same sentiment. Exploration and colonization were as much commonly agreed practices then as, for instance, space exploration is now. Just think of American plans to build a permanent base on the moon and later send humans to Mars. It was a similar approach to going out into the unknown. So on one hand, there was technological innovation, and of course the great exhibition of 1851 in London showed what ingenuity could achieve, including some Tudors and pipe organs. But on the other hand, Darwinism and scientific race theory also facilitated an ideology in which humans, like plants and animals, could be subdivided into superior and inferior classes. Furthermore, by stressing Darwin's concept of natural selection and adaptation, it was believed that humans had adapted in specific ways to match the respective climatic conditions in which they lived. In that sense, it was understood that British people should only ever settle in regions with temperate climates, such as North America, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, but also, from around 1900 onwards, in the highlands of East Africa, where the year-round climate resembles London in springtime and early summer. Europeans thus never settled in the tropical climate of West Africa. So this is two really distinct histories here. In West Africa, they were only interested in the extraction of raw materials such as palm oil, cocoa, sugar, various minerals, and petroleum, of course. European colonial officials, businessmen, and missionaries only went there on temporary tours, and it was often seen as patriotic and heroic when they did so. In any case, it was in West Africa where Captain Frederick Lugard, the British colonial official, encouraged a Western education for Africans as early as the 19-teens. This included the cathedral organist of the Anglican Cathedral of Lagos, Thomas King Equandayo Phillips. Phillips, in a similar way as Lucien Netzinger, was sent to London to train as an organist. He did so already between 1911 and 1914, before taking on the position at Christ Church Cathedral in Lagos as the director of music and organist there, and staying there for 48 years. His work inspired a whole generation of organists and composers from Nigeria, amongst them Fela Showande, of whom I played two pieces yesterday, which blend a European mid-20th century organ idiom with traditional Yoruba melodies. Allow me, for those who couldn't attend the recital, to play a brief extract of the piece Obangiji. So there is Fela Showande, and here comes the video. have the traditional Yoruba melodies coming in. This is where the melody of the tune Obagiji first appears. Obagiji is a song that celebrates the Almighty God in the Yoruba religion. And then later on the piece develops and comes to a grandiose conclusion. Very different from what we just seen and heard from West Africa was the situation on the other side of the continent in East Africa, notably in Kenya, or Kenya as it was known then, which is going to be the last stop of our tour today. The country we know today started off in 1902 as British East Africa, became India colony and protectorate in 1920, and an independent republic in 1963. All too often, we tend to turn a blind eye on the fact that, until the late 1950s, a group of British settlers still believed that Kenya, as they called it, could become yet another white country like the traditional white dominions 50 years earlier by suppressing the non-white members of the society there. This attitude provoked one of the most brutal and atrocious colonial confrontations of the late history of the British Empire, what is commonly known today as the Mau Mau Uprising. Amongst other things, the British military used the same Lancaster bombers in Kenya in the 1950s that 10 years earlier were used over Europe in the bombing raids of World War II. Before I will explain how pipe organs fit into all this, let us take a look at the following video.
In Nairobi, capital of Kenya, Europeans and Africans still walk the streets in fear of the dreaded Mau Mau. For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya. A week ago, the people of Kenya read of the death of Chief Nderi, murdered by terrorists. And now, as they watch the funeral of this wise and peaceful chieftain, they wonder where next will the Mau Mau strike. Troops are in the streets of Nairobi. Sir Evelyn Baring, the governor, salutes the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers who have thrown in to help clear his colony of the Mau Mau menace, which has struck fear into Kenya's very heart. Nairobi police have been supplemented by hundreds of civilians, many of them women, to help round up the Mau Mau bandits. Radio-controlled cars with armored vehicles are used to carry out the army's plans for bringing in all suspects. More than 3,500 have been arrested already. All have to be carefully checked by police security men, for in such a decisive swoop as this, it is all too easy for the innocent to suffer. The objective of this secret society is to drive all white men out of Kenya. Not only fanatics fill the ranks of the Mau Mau, many have joined from fear. Day after day, hour after hour, lorries bearing police and troops drive away from the capital and head for the country. Along twisting roads, they travel deeper, ever deeper into the heart of the African jungle. For here, many of the Mau Mau are hiding.
And it's in the midst of this race-based conflict that the white settlers had the pipe organ in their cathedral in Nairobi rebuilt. Exact same period. In this context, two key keep in mind that the Kenyan society was almost as segregated then as apartheid South Africa was. So Africans were absolutely off limits at the White Cathedral except to carry out menial jobs. On the other hand, Harold Stark from London, who I'm sure many of you know as the composer of popular Anglican mass settings, was invited to inaugurate this instrument at the same time as a few hundred yards away from the cathedral, Kenyan Africans were detained in concentration camps in the hundreds. However, there's yet another side of this admittedly very gloomy and uncomfortable history, namely a story of transformation and reconciliation after independence. The following clip shows the same organ that I've been talking about 70 years later. You will hear one of the cathedral organists, who is just one of many young people who are currently trying, as much as their circumstances allow, to hone their skills as performers. And you will hear a member of the PCC of the cathedral and one of the canons when they talk about the meaning of the instrument for them. I hope afterwards, in the discussion, you could share your impressions amongst one another and with us in the group. Yeah. Okay. No idea what's going on. Okay. It's always the last slide that causes the hiccup. Let's try again. I think this is just a computer crash. Okay, so let me see.
Maybe just try pressing return.
Nope.
No.
Okay. Let me see if I can play it externally then. Come on. It would be such a shame if I couldn't show you this, because it's really okay. We're gonna get there. That's the one. There we go.
My name is John Kabumba. I'm one of the organists here at All Saints Cathedral, Nairobi. I play this lovely instrument for 7 years now. It's special to me. It's an instrument I've learned how to play the organ from all the way 7 years ago. And it's the instrument that I use regularly to accompany choirs, to play solo items for services and concerts. The organ is special as an instrument because there's so many ways you can make a single piece of music. You can interpret music in very different ways and have as many colors as the organ has available for you to use.
This cathedral in itself is in the history books of this country. So when people think of this cathedral in the history books, the organ is not far from that as well. I can't imagine a service here without the organ. The cathedral will be missing one of its limbs because without it, it is not a cathedral as far as many of the congregants would express.
The organ potentially outdates majority of people who come to worship here, and that historical value brings with it a sense that has grown and built and nurtured music here at the cathedral in a way that newer generations cannot imagine, even the origins and the process of that happening. And so it holds a very key place in the life and ministry, worship life and ministry of All Saints Cathedral.
think there's little that could or should be added at this point to these powerful words. However, let me reiterate that in our exploration this afternoon we have not done more than simply scratch the surface. And there is so much more that hopefully will be discovered about the global aspects of the British pipe organ culture by our academic community over the years to come. Many thanks for attention, and I would be delighted now to answer any questions you might have and to engage in a conversation with all of you.
I really like your material history approach, which I think is pragmatically, obviously sensible. I was just wondering whether there is room to expand to think about the psychological and theological implications of people's own sense of what they are doing as being historically embedded. And I'm wondering, in parts of the world where perhaps there's been some competition between different confessional missions, what Protestants are always anxious about is demonstrating in a way that despite the fact that they're Protestants, that they have a kind of historical depth to them, and whether that in Protestant communities as part of the British diaspora has attached itself to the sound of the organ as representing a symbol, if you like, of historical depth. Is that something which is relevant to the particularly African communities you've looked at?
I would say so, yes. So I think we have to see two very distinct scenarios here. Except for probably just a handful of cinema organs, there is very little secular organ playing that I'm so far aware of in sub-Saharan Africa, and what goes on is almost exclusively connected with churches and worship, especially in Protestant contexts. Not so much in the Catholic Church, but it does exist there as well, so it's not absent, but it's of course primarily Anglican churches where you will find the biggest organs and so forth. And of course, this may also have to do that, of course, in England, the Anglican Church was the established church, and it was just basically, in terms of what they could afford, probably the most affluent in these contexts. In the wider dominions, I would argue that the secular side of organ playing played a much more important role and was also generally, as far as I can say now, and this is also what is being suggested by the existing literature, which is not overly abundant, but still, there seems to be a very clear trend that during these decades, secular organ playing was the one that was also always the more innovative one, the one that pushed development, and the church organs were basically lagging behind 10, 15, 20 years, and then gradually introduced those new kind of gadgets that were invented in the secular context also into the church use. And of course it was very often the same players anyway who played secular and church-based instruments. But I think we need to look at it from these two separate angles. And yes, it is quite obvious when you go to worship services in Africa, in Protestant churches, that they often want to show that they're doing it the right way by really putting on very traditional European hymnody. And it is often also the case that you will hear hymns that we have long expunged here, like Onward Christian Soldiers, and that kind of segment of the hymn repertoire, that is being sung most fervently in the African context, even though you would assume that this would trigger some colonial kind of connections, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It's more the opposite, and so many hymnals. Maybe this is also more a pragmatic reason, lack of money, are still hymnals from the 1930s that I've seen. So there's really just old hymn books, and they just keep using them because they're there, and new ones would be quite expensive. So there is this, and of course the Catholic Church after Vatican II has gone a very, very, very different route because it tries really to actively encourage and incorporate the vernacular and also more traditional forms of music in worship. So if you go, for instance, to Kenya and Tanzania, in the Catholic context, you will almost exclusively find tunes, chants sung in Swahili to melodies, however, that very often were composed by German missionaries during the German period in Tanzania, and from there the Swahili as a standardized language, and also Swahili worship music spread all over East Africa, including Kenya and Uganda. So there's also kind of a hierarchy that is very noticeable there, and for many Kenyans, only the Tanzanian Swahili and the Tanzanian music is regarded as the real one, proper one. So there are many things going on there, but this is a hugely important aspect that certainly has to be considered a lot. Jonathan.
Michael, thank you for that very dense, and it's just packed with so much, and there are so many ideas, so many dimensions to it. But one of the things that we discussed yesterday about when does the organ become native? But I want to ask you another question. Why does the organ become native? What's the reason? And again, just a little bit of context. In my experience, you see that when the organ is taken into this new culture of natives post-independence, there tends to be a reason why they're doing it. It's not necessarily to celebrate the organ or to celebrate colonization or anything British, but it tends to be a greater cause. And in my experience in Mumbai and in India, it tends to be Christianity and Christian values. But I'd like to know in terms of Africa, because I think yesterday we didn't touch on the reason why, and it would be really nice to know what is the reason people take in this organ and maintain this style of worship.
Thank you for that very important question. I must say, however, that as I've alluded already in our conversation yesterday, that this is at the moment pushing me slightly out of my comfort zone, because the actual rigorous research to answer that question has not yet been done. So at the moment I'm really focusing on the white dominions, and I'm slightly hesitant to kind of make conjectures just out of gut feeling. But I mean, certainly, as you've also seen in the video just a couple minutes ago, it's the organ in connection with the hymn singing, in connection with the worship experience and the enhancement of that worship experience that has a really, really, really strong value, and the repertoire playing is certainly secondary. So it does exist, and the young organists who all watch YouTube avidly and see all the big performers play the most difficult organ pieces on the loudest organs in the world with the most number of stops, which is really it does trigger emotions there. They of course they try to play these pieces, but there is relatively little space where they could really perform them in front of a sizable audience. So it is really the context of hymnody, of hymn singing. And for instance, in the Nigerian context, you will find a very strong tradition of improvised hymn arrangements, partitas, variations on popular melodies that they either write down or more often just basically make up on the spot as they go.
Right, just bouncing off that very quickly is we spoke a little bit about enculturation, and you spoke a little bit about Vatican II and the other way it's gone into the vernacular, and we would see that as enculturation of the church. But actually, there is a bit of that happening here as well, and you see that the community's taken in this instrument and is using it in a different way, and there is some kind of enculturation or reverse enculturation happening. So is there a parallel there between, say, what the Catholic Church is doing and what the organs from the Anglican churches are actually doing in the community?
Here I can mostly only draw on my experience from East Africa, and you have to consider that you are dealing with two very different mentalities. So what I have seen, and again this is not this is just me referring to you, relaying to you my observations. There is no research that I'm drawing on here. Is that in the East African context, Catholic organists often are more poorly trained than their Catholic counterparts in West Africa. There is a very, very clear distinction that can be made. And because of that strong Swahili-based liturgical music that they have, which is often written down in ways that would not necessarily, where the written text on the page would not necessarily reflect what is actually sung in practice, both in terms of melody, harmony, and rhythm. So when I was asked to be the organist for the service of Pope Francis in Nairobi in 2016, with a choir of 300 there, and all the kind of the pressure of TV coverage and cardinals kind of being stressed out, and bishops and all that. It was a very interesting experience. I had to play a lot of these Swahili worship songs, and I had to be shown how they wanted them to perform, because if I just reproduced in the way we are trained what was on the page, it was going to say, no, this is not, no, you're playing the wrong thing here. And this is just, so there is a lot of oral tradition, passed on knowledge that is not codified, not written down, but it's just basically shown. But it's also, there is very, very little in the Catholic context, usually very little academic musicianship that you would see. So it's very, very different there, and in West Africa standards are very different. So for instance, also like think back of the example that you saw from Ghana, which is arguably the African country which has by and large on average the highest standard in terms of organ playing and choral music. Uganda at the moment is also very high, and others basically are just somewhere in the middle, but they all know of one another. So social media has done an enormous service for African organists, choral conductors, singers, the whole community centered around liturgical music, to have cross influences. So they might not know the people in person, but they, the sort of video that I showed you was first sent to me by a colleague who lived in Nairobi and now is based in Harare. So it's like they watch videos, they check out what's going on, because it's so easy, and Facebook helps, and YouTube helps, and WhatsApp helps, and things really spread. And just to kind of refer to you, like over the last 15 years when I first started going, to see how the availability of the internet has contributed to a knowledge of repertoire, to a knowledge of playing styles, and so forth, of organs even, around the world. That's quite remarkable. And of course there is one factor that also has to be acknowledged here, and of course I wonder how this then reflects with your background from India, which is the American influence. So there is a lot of American cultural influence noticeable. Of course, you have this massive influx of evangelical Christianity coming from the US into West Africa, Nigeria mainly, and from there spreading all across Africa. So in Kenya, for instance, they talk about the Nigerian churches when they mean the American evangelicals. So this is the way. So basically, Nigeria is the hub, and from there it then is carried out. And with these churches, which are of course also very appealing, comes a completely different worship music, which does not really have any space for the organ at all, as we all know. And so there is now kind of a competition going on, and it's a bit. We had a podcast recording yesterday with the wonderful Catherine Dunford, who is here. It's so nice to see you again. And we mentioned about the existing pipe organs, that we are now really at a watershed moment in terms of if we want to have these organs restored, we need to act soon, because otherwise the degree of deterioration would go beyond the point of no return. So if we don't really do anything within the next 10, 15 years perhaps, these organs will either disappear because their value isn't understood, or the restoration would be so expensive that you would really seriously have to question if it is responsible to invest that much money into such a project. But at the same time, you also have to kind of, now what I've seen during my last couple of visits, a competition between the traditional organ-based worship style and this kind of evangelical worship style, which is also spilling over into the traditional established denominations. So very often they run it in parallel, where they have the church, the church as such does the traditional worship, and the church hall at the same time has the praise band in the Anglican context. So there is now already a very noticeable kind of shift going on, which is a relatively novel thing, and I haven't noticed it, for instance, 10 years ago. But for the last 4 or 5 years, this has been a very strong force now, where of course it seems that this is being done to prevent a migration from the Anglican or Presbyterian churches into the evangelical Pentecostal ones. So if that, I hope this answers the question. Yeah. Yes, Catherine.
So it's a strange, I think it's another one that pushes into discomfort. If we flip that round and think of what's happening in the Western context, where we do have evangelical worship that incorporates gospel and organs, are there any parallels with the sort of the I want to say loose and fast way that the organ is played in Africa, the way that, and how that is the different standards in popular play and worship? Is that reflected in the Western context too? Can we see different levels of organ playing as organs are used in evangelical settings, which may not necessarily have the same players? You may not have the same organ player in an evangelical setting as you would in a, say, Catholic or Anglican setting. So is there, do we know if there is a change in the way that organs are being played in the West through the same mechanisms but perhaps slightly different?
So just to be clear on the question, so you mean about what's going on here in terms of...
Is there a parallel in terms of, because obviously we're looking at it in the African context where there isn't necessarily the established academic side, and not there have the level of instrumentation that we do here in the West. It's not, the organ is there, it's come from here. The organ is here, it comes from here. Is there a change in the way the organ's being played because of the same influences, so the evangelical influence? Obviously there are people who leave the Anglican established faith to go into evangelical churches in the West as well. And has that had an influence in the way organists play the organ in the West?
We can open this question up because there are many very competent colleagues here, and I think I'm even with less competent perhaps than some of you here. So, I mean,
it's a terrible question, I'm sorry.
no. It's a very legitimate. Yeah, I think this is a really important, legitimate question. I mean, may I just turn to Chris for help? Perhaps, do you have any ideas?
I
on
can
this?
only offer really anecdotal evidence. What I hear very often when I go to visit important historic organs in often very unfashionable places where frequently the Anglican Church in question has taken a turn towards evangelical style worship. What you often hear has become a kind of trope, and perhaps colleagues can corroborate that a little bit. The organ, when it's used, is used at funerals and it's used at Christmas. Does that ring a bell with colleagues, just looking at colleagues around the room?
Yeah.
So what you'll find, the implication is that there is a generation who still want to hear the organ, and for the time being that there is a younger generation that doesn't, because they have negative connotations of the instrument. And that runs in parallel, of course, with exactly the kind of shift in musical influence which occurs in those worship styles which Michael's described in Africa. I don't know whether Andrew or Freddie or anybody else.
Yeah, I think my gut feeling is that there is not a recognisable evangelical approach to organ play. It is that it is not played by and large, and that it's seen as being from a different tradition.
What I can say, however, in connection to this, in the African setting, and I think this is a real distinct difference here, is that in those more evangelical settings with contemporary worship music, it is not the organ that is the kind of would be a point of contention at all. It's more that it's the package that is appealing, and this package simply doesn't usually entail the organ, so nobody minds the absence of it, but at the same time, the same people would probably be perfectly happy if somebody invited them to come to the organ recital or go to the big hymn sing. So there is certainly way less kind of a much smaller barrier of those people who go to the evangelical more kind of worship to still be open to listen to organ music, to participate in the hymn singing and such. So it's way less stratified, I would say, than what I've noticed from here.
I think there are exceptions, and Tom Bell, for example, has a lot of experience of playing the organ with a band in an evangelical context, and a way that works really well. But I think that's the exception.
Yes. And of course, the church halls wouldn't have organs normally, so it's all back. It's basically a really pragmatic kind of reason why the situation is what it is. But it's a more kind of a general cultural phenomenon, and it's of course also still very much the appeal of America that I think plays out here.
Just to add to that, I think it really depends on the music you're playing or singing in church, because if it's music that's difficult to play on the organ and it involves a lot of rearranging, it might be more effective to play it on the piano.
Yes.
And that just works.
Yeah.
But another question is also with the advent of pianos, and we see this in India with digital instruments. It's just so much easier to have a modern piano or a digital piano rather than an organ. What have you found to be the motivations to preserve and to restore organs?
This is a very interesting question, and again let me come back to All Saints Cathedral in Nairobi, where the organ is currently under restoration. They are under a lot of scrutiny there from here. So there is, they are the most visible church in Kenya at the moment, in the Anglican setting, and they have the connections with the See of Canterbury and all that, so there is always exchange. They have always visiting groups from Britain, from Canada, from you name it, and so they are being watched and they know it. And they have heard that this is, I'm speaking of based on actual conversations with leaders in that church, they have noticed that the global north, amongst church leaders and music professionals, does not particularly like digital organs. And they are very keen not to cause issues that would basically then play out negatively in the way they are being perceived. So they are quite happy to say, okay, no, we want to do it the right way, and we have heard that digital organs are not the right way, therefore we want our pipe organ to be restored. That is one motivation. And of course the other motivation is of course that the organ, again, it is there and people love it, and they feel enough motivation also to give money for that purpose. So there is, I think, a dual rationale behind this here.
Right, I can't help but bounce
Yes.
on the digital organs now, because
I've opened. I will regret this.
With the video as well, I mean, I have a big question. Given the climate of Africa, India,
Yes.
and how difficult it is to maintain and restore pipe organs, and funds genuinely, I mean, clergy and members of the church always mention that they have to make a huge decision for all that money to go into restoration rather than community work. Can digital organs promote organ culture, or do they only destroy organ culture? For instance,
Okay.
I think we should keep this for another day.
would take us at least an hour to elaborate a beautiful argument and to kind of propose this. I think what should be said here in this context, because we've mostly spoken about a lack of infrastructure and opportunities for organists, but in the context of the existing pipe instruments, really the biggest obstacle, even more probably I would say than the climate, is the lack of competent maintenance people. So when a pipe organ is restored or also built from scratch, which happens every now and then, you will very often find when you go and see that instrument after a year or so after it has been installed, that it is in really appalling condition. Out of tune, keys not working, ciphers, stops completely unusable. So I've seen it all, and the reason is that you would, if you want to have the organ maintained, you always would have to fly somebody out from here to maintain it, because there is barely any competent organ builder on the continent as a whole. There is one gentleman who has started a really interesting project in Tanzania, based in connection with the German Lutheran Church, which is apparently still quite strong there. So he's a German organ builder who moved to Tanzania and started a project where he trains carpenters in the first place, but then he also gives them the opportunity to learn how to build and maintain pipe organs, and they have, I think, built a couple from scratch there, which are kind of 6-8 rank instruments, but still these instruments exist. I don't know if he's still active, but so there are a few exceptions, but it is again giving you the concrete example of the Nairobi instrument. The way it worked was that there was a mathematician from St. John's College, Cambridge, who went out in the 60s, I believe, or even 50s, to be a maths teacher at Makerere University in Kampala, and in his retirement he moved to Nairobi, and he had always been an organist, so he became the cathedral organist, and since he was a kind of a tech-savvy person, he taught himself how to maintain the organ, and he did so for, I don't know, 15-20 years, and had a little retirement business in Nairobi, going on fixing and mending and tuning all the existing organs to the best of his abilities. And he then trained an African person with whom he had become quite friendly, and after this gentleman's death, his African disciple then carried on in a similar fashion, But this is really, I would say, this is, if you call it fixing, you are already very generous. This is really kind of, this is really difficult because it's so easy for us to ridicule it, and at the same time, it is really, this is their lifelines. This is the best they have, and they are lucky to have him, because otherwise they would have been completely out of options very long ago. So it's always really a question of relativity, but it would be really an amazing feat if some young folks from Africa could be trained and apprenticed here for even a couple of months to show them the most basic skills, which admittedly are not that difficult. Even I was able to learn some of them. And then even if they weren't full-time organ builders, but still there would be people around who would be able to maintain a certain standard of the pipe instruments, because otherwise it would be really quite difficult to make the argument for pipe organs against digital in this very context. But we're not going there now, we decided. So that's not, but I think this is a really important aspect to it, the aspect of maintenance. Yes?
I don't know whether you got it. I sent Chris an article a couple of days ago. The latest Ethnomusicology Forum has got an article in it about a Nigerian organist who went to London to study organ playing, I think, at the Royal Academy, but at the same time trained to be an instrument technologist, so that when he went back he could both maintain the organ himself and play it. I don't know, it's just an interesting case study of somebody who realised in Nigeria that that would be a useful combination.
Wonderful. I haven't seen the article, but that's...
Get Chris to forward
Yes, that is wonderful. Thank you so much for that. That's amazing. Yes, please.
Aside from all of the reasons we've just discussed, which seem to be sort of totally practical,
yes.
Does the kind of more recent political focus on symbols of colonialism and kind of, in often cases, rejection of them present a kind of threat to the continued existence of organs in countries such as the ex-African colonies?
Yes and no. No, I start with a no. I haven't seen any such issues on the ground. We've discussed it also in the context of India. So it is very uncommon to find people in Africa objecting. However, so this is the yes part of the answer, it has become, when I speak with people, particularly in academic context, it has become more and more difficult to pitch the interest that I'm pursuing and to make an advocacy why we should still looking at an instrument that could be, if you wanted to, could be seen as a symbol of the colonial past, by excluding the voices that I wanted to show you in the last video. If we blank them out and just look at the fact that the organs are still there, then yes, this is an issue. This is an absolute issue, and it really depends on who is willing to support it, and also who is willing to give money for this to function. And of course, what happens, and now I'm guilty of kind of coming back to the digital, is of course digital organ companies quite often who sees the business opportunities and just send people there, and then you have this kind of, they don't care about all these implications, so they are then able to sell quite a significant number of their instruments because everything else is absent.
It's an issue, I suppose, because the people that that are interested in this and would potentially donate money to it and who actually have the practical skills to do it are people like us and are white and from Britain. And I suppose if there was ever that kind of political sentiment present, there's absolutely, there's not a lot of scope to really do anything about it, unless, like you say, there can be sort of much more of a focus on setting up local firms and teaching local people how to do this.
I think it's all really, the question is really how to frame it, how to present it here more than there. But of course, the one thing that one has to be really, 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 really careful about is when interacting on the ground in Africa, to avoid falling again into the kind of the white savior trope, into this kind of I know better and I'm telling you, and this is how you do it, are you supposed to do it, and I'm not engaging in anything you want to tell me, but this is the way and the only way. And this can be very difficult, and it has happened to me that I've, against my will, been put on a pedestal and expected to have all the answers readily available. And this is often really difficult to say, well, wait a minute, what do you think? What is it that you really want? What is it, how can we look at this together in a kind of a collegiate way? How can we kind of find ways that would really express who you are, how you should approach this issue also of church music, of organs, how to kind of be mindful of the past and not replicating and all that. This sometimes it's you have to kind of even push for that rather than say, okay, no, can we just place? So it's a really interesting one. I don't know, Jonathan, is this something you can relate to?
I would, I'd like to add actually, because so the case study I did in Mumbai, the organ in Wesley Church, Colaba, is restored by someone completely local, and it's a complete restoration done. Now he sort of self-taught, but he has been in a lot of correspondence with an organ building firm in Boston, and wants to go there to upgrade his skills and stuff. But he's done all the work just by himself, not importing anything, which I think there lies a nice skill of innovatively restoring the organ respectfully, trying to maintain the ethos of the restoration. So the restoration principles, not really modifying anything, but at the same time not really building the church in such a way where all these components need to be imported, just to cause something with the blower of the organ, and which would have maybe just been imported. But what he did is that he took the impeller of the blower, went to an industrial firm, got that repaired with the industrial firm, and fitted it back into the blower. So these innovations, and he speaks about a lot about there is the industry for it in different ways. For instance, when you talk about carpentry work and hardware and all of that's really there, but you just need to know how to do it, where to get the leather from, where to get all these things from, and do it. But he did mention this as well, and he said, I would love to do an internship overseas, and he's very keen to go to Boston or whatever works for him. This guy was actually engaged as opposed to a British firm. And because of the cost, because the cost of the British firm was just too much for the church to afford, and they kind of got someone local who kind of knew the market and knew how to get by. And I think there is a bit of that happening in South India as well. Of course, some are restored by British firms if it's possible for the church to, it's feasible, and if the committee decides. Otherwise, they do have a few of the local builders who kind of, some better than others, who kind of find a way of doing it and know the climate and do things like extra resin and polish, things like that climatically preserves the organ. So there is a bit of that. I think we need much more of that, but there are a few people who can.
And of course, you have to kind of really negotiate between a couple important issues here. On one hand, one wants to support the local skill, the local craftsmanship, and so forth. Then you would kind of, I don't want to share too many kind of internals of the Nairobi project, but of course there has been a similar offer made for the Nairobi organ as well. A group of people who said, okay, look, we are resourceful, we are skilled, so why don't we just kind of try to get it done ourselves, and it would be a fraction of the cost, it would perhaps take a little longer, but we could still do it, and then it would be our instrument, and we get the components from overseas, and we would. And of course, then on the other hand, we are engaging here with the highest possible standards of organ restoration and preservation, and you have to kind of there is the financial aspect, and then there is of course the aspect of trusting those relatively little trained or relatively inexperienced craftsmen, and also the question to what extent is this perhaps causing irreparable damage to the instrument if it doesn't go well, because it might very well end up in a glorious restoration, or in one that is good enough for what it's supposed to do in the context of the worship for which they want to have the organ, rather than the glorious concert instrument. So there's that, but on the other hand, it could also really end up in a complete disaster and chaos. And this is again coming back to the British world kind of discourse that I talked about before. These were exactly the issues also in question in the context of the White Dominions in the 1880s and 90s, because there were enough stories of organ builders, local people who were sent pipe organs from Britain in boxes to be assembled on the ground by local people who were more or less capable, and things really completely failing humongously, and organ builders losing their reputation, and some left because they felt, okay, now I'm finished, and because they weren't able to get the organ to work, and others had to come in and do the job, because and so there were. I've come across sources that were quite interesting to see how this, and again coming back to Sydney, this is the aspect of trust, with Hill being so well established, with big instruments all across New South Wales and Victoria, that they said, okay, we have an agent there. Hill has proven with at least 5 or 6 big instruments that they can deliver good organs. So let's go with that firm, because we know, rather than trying something that could also go wrong and we would lose an awful lot of money. So there are a couple factors really that are playing against one another.
What builders, just out of interest, were involved in the Nairobi?
I think I'm not in a position.
Were originally.
Originally.
No.
So this is so the organ builder is called Lawton, based in Aberdeen. So he was an Englishman who set up shop in Aberdeen, I think between the wars, and started exploring the East African market, and built also, for instance, the cathedral organ in Mombasa, but also other instruments, also in the Rhodesias, I know, and then he retired in New Zealand. So he had a really kind of imperial life for himself, global life. And then the Walkers did the 1950s expansion of the organ.
I think we may, due to circumstances, be obliged to stop now, as I suspect someone else will want to make use of the room. But I'm just to say personally how what a great pleasure it's been to have colleague and friend Michael here these last 2 days. He played a fantastic recital yesterday, and as you've seen, you can listen to it on YouTube if you weren't able to be there in person. And we recorded, as he implied, a really fascinating podcast also with Jonathan yesterday afternoon, which is going to be the first podcast of the university's new Kaleidoscope network, the BAME network for alumni, and that should be appearing in the next couple of weeks once I've got it all edited down. And I have to say the conversation was fascinating, and you will enjoy that once we're able to put it into the public domain. And thank you also for your talk this afternoon. You know from my perspective how much I love to push the organ culture and the significance of the organ culture to its limits, and Michael is busy finding new limits of the international significance, cultural and societal significance of the organ culture, and that makes me very happy indeed. Will you please give Michael show Michael your appreciation? Thank you.